I'd like to thank SVA and Mark Tribe for the opportunity to speak this evening. I'm thrilled to be here. I'd also like to thank Liz Cook for initiating the invitation. And I'd like to thank the 7 students I met in the studios this afternoon. We had a very, very interesting and I hope helpful discussion. I was very gratified to know that many of the themes they're working on in their work, I'm talking about this evening. So I hope that will hold your attention. There are a few contextual thoughts about this work the paper that I'm giving tonight, but I think I'll save those for the Q&A at the end. So here we go. Ever tried, ever failed? A Politics of Intimacy. Samuel Beckett in Worstward Ho writes, ever tried, ever failed? No matter. Try again. Fail again. Fail better. Today I present failure, the limitations of voice in expressing collective and historical trauma in the public sphere. Michel Foucault asks, how much does it cost the subject to be able to tell the truth about itself? But Jacques Derrida suggests that friendship is better preserved by silence. Friendship tells the truth, and this is always better left unknown. This suggests a discrepancy between the necessity of telling the truth and the dangers in doing so. In conflicts around the world, the relation of speech to legitimacy is critical. Whether we infiltrate repression to raise our voices, stifle our despair, or spill our anxiety as a flood over a broken dam, we express an act of defiance. I will tell a story of friends and foe, of repression, revolution, and the resonance of silence, presenting works by artists from Latin America, Spain, Iceland, Belarus, Estonia, Armenia, Lebanon, and the US, in order to consider the limitations of language and the transgression of speech into and out of silence. The prevalence of the use of found text in these artists' work suggests a rupture, if not a complete breakdown, in our manner of communication. Looking at the contradictory meanings of the word stasis, the metaphor of walking as the locutionary seat of language, and the mutable boundaries between political and intimate speech, I take as a point of departure Jacques Derrida's book, The Politics of Friendship, in order to frame a reflection on a politics of intimacy revealed through the work of various contemporary artists. For Francis Alice, poetic license operates like a hiatus, an agent provocateur, a short circuit into the apathy of a situation that finds itself in the state of political, social, confessional, ethnic, economic, or military crisis or lethargy. He incorporates walking into his practice to navigate the relation between perceptual and aesthetic realms, creating meaning from actions or sense from nonsense. Walking is not a medium, Alice says. It's an attitude. To walk is a very handy way of interacting and eventually interfering within a given context. It is counterintuitive to virtual motion. It is also a displacement of being and recognition of the fruitlessness the fruitfulness of doing, even when that doing makes little sense. Philosopher and social historian Michel de Certeau suggests that to walk is to be without place, to be in search of a position in relation to the social space through and around which we navigate. The walker enunciates the position here and there, which are linguistically the locutionary seat of verbal communication. They are, in other words, the linguistic position of I, here, and you, there. From the point of departure to arrival, from speaker to listener, artist to subject, friend to foe. The invisible line drawn between two can connect or divide. This is clearly enunciated in the artist's well-known work, The Green Line, performed in Jerusalem in 2004, that echoes a previous work, The Leak, performed in São Paulo in 1995. In São Paulo, he walks through the city carrying a leaking can of paint, and then retraces his path back to the gallery to hang the empty can on the wall. A reference to both the action painting technique of Jackson Pollock and the self-reflexive status of painting, of, in particular, modernist painting. The Green Line, however, was overtly political, bringing the same action to bear on retracing the armistice boundary of the 1948 Arab-Israeli War, drawn by Moshe Dayan on a map and redrawn to incorporate the annexed territory after the 1967 Six-Day War. In his most recent film, entitled Real Unreal, commissioned by Documenta 13 and exhibited in Kabul, Afghanistan in 2011 as a contingent project to Kassel, Germany, Elise's linear trajectory becomes a circuitous path with a playful, circular momentum. And some of you may have seen this earlier in the year at David Swerner Gallery. The 20-minute film opens with children playing hoops with rubber bicycle tires on the streets of Old City in Kabul. They then substitute the tires for reels of film. One youth dressed in white unreels a red spool of film. The other youth dressed in black follows the first, rewinding the film onto the second spool. They follow each other in a race through the streets and crowded bazaar of the urban center until at last the reels fly off the hillside and are lost. Like the 16th century Flemish painter Peter Bruegel, Elise is fascinated by the creative and heuristic potential of children's games. Unpretentious and seemingly insignificant, like walking, they allow for interference in an environment, interjecting a dynamic that yields open-ended and unpredictable results. In other words, the action of the camera focuses on the two children. Everyone else is not acting, posing for the camera. They're allowing life to go on as normal. Just as pushing a block of ice once served for Elise as metaphor for sculpture, the child's play of rolling a hoop becomes an allegory of representation and the act of observation. How or even why does an artist from Belgium who lives and works in Mexico come to Afghanistan to create a work of art? What kinds of meaning can be created when the grounds for engagement are so uncertain? As in previous tasks, Elise's project involved, quote, an idea, a medium, a location, and an interlocutor. So 4 ingredients, basically. Two young actors from Kabul are on-screen interlocutors through movement rather than dialogue. Ultimately, however, it is the social space of Old City that we come to see through Elise's device of interference. Following his lens on the action of play, everything else falls within the frame surreptitiously, presented in an uninhibited manner, delineating a community. Our gaze opens to the spontaneity of unraveling, the action of a game, and the discreet unveiling of a neighborhood through a non-heroic adventure, one that would have very different meanings for a war-weary Afghani or a Western audience. Conflating the words real and real, the picture created by this short film represents a moment when the balance between collapse and recovery is also a precarious representation in the full social and juridical sense of the word. There are few girls at play in the streets of Old City, and Elise knows he may not respectfully film the face of a woman in this environment. Derrida, in a lengthy explication of the meaning of friendship, halts his discussion on Nietzsche and Heidegger sharply by asking, how much of a chance would a feminine friend have on this stage, and a feminine friend of hers among themselves? Deciding the response is one of tonality or suspension, he quickly moves on. Lena Sieb, however, does not. She lingers over such a question. In a coffee shop one day, the photographer read in an opinion column, quote, that women are used to less space in the workplace and less pay than men, unquote. This prompted her project entitled A Woman Takes Little Space, documenting the condition of women's work in her native Estonia. Using strategies of unveiling, she registers the collapse of social and political promises and the resulting impact on individual lives, bringing to light friends who would have little chance on the hegemonic stage of business, politics, and cronyism. Her inclusion of prostitutes, also known as streetwalkers, sets up an interesting dilemma of participation. In Sieb's video Adverse Body, they are heard and not seen, emphasizing the invisibility within social space is due less to our ability to see as to our ability to listen. Similarly, Ajgik Melkonian, in her how-to manual, A Monthly Salary, from 2011 Venice Biennale, considers what Michel de Certeau terms the practice of everyday life by documenting the discrepancy between the means of production and tactics for survival. This is the intuitive collusion between intimate and social spheres as we literally beg, borrow, and steal our way to the end of the month. This is our means of eking out an existence in a low-wage economy. Here, gender is subsumed into the larger category, opportunity, where one is compelled to creatively grapple with disadvantageous conditions, and where basic terms of survival leave the question of broader social participation unresolved, in the sense that you're so busy trying to get by each day that you have absolutely no opportunity to form activist politics. One wonders if the method of presentation isn't too corporate for its content, or if perhaps this is the key to its irony. Compare, for example, the broadsides papering the stairwells of the 7th Berlin Biennial in Marina Naprushkina's Self-Governing. Since 2010, she publishes and distributes the newspaper Convincing Victory throughout her native Belarus as part of a larger project, the Office of Anti-Propaganda, founded in 2007, which dares to imagine a future minus President Lukashenko. Naprushkina's work, particularly her writing on the wall in Berlin, can be seen as a manual for daring to think bravely. Rabi Moué from Beirut is well aware of the struggle for political alternatives and downloads off the internet both a manual for filming demonstrations, and you see an excerpt in the image insert, as well as cell phone footage of an assassination during Syrian protests in the spring of 2012. His accordion-like installation for the World Is Not Fair exhibition in Berlin sequences the action frame by frame. As the viewer traverses the corridor, she becomes an actor in a drama of recognition, face to face with her assassin. Though double shooting is a reenactment of the original cell phone footage, the artist asks if it is any lesser witness to the last few seconds of a Syrian protester's life. In both, the final moments are blurred. Like tragic drama, violence occurs off stage, but also in an endless loop of shot, countershot, the cinematic language of reversal. In the muddled boundaries between reality, representation, and truth, Moué depicts a stage where the recognition of death is uncertain and speech collapses in the wings. The term writing on the wall suggests impending doom, as it originates from the book of Daniel, chapter 5, the Feast of Belshazzar, and the Aramaic script that appears in code, scripted by a disembodied hand and interpreted by the prophet Daniel. You might recall the fairly well-known painting by Rembrandt that depicts that moment. Nida Colazzo-Lawrence literalizes what has become an ordinary aphoristic expression through a public intervention that acts as interface between the concrete reality of existence and the excess of internet noise that makes up our virtual world. Revolution is a site-specific text-based work on the facade of, a chapel in San Juan, commissioned for the 3rd Polygraphic Triennial. It is solely composed of found text, arbitrarily selected from internet sites that cover the wall in a turbulence of conflicting verbal conditions. In the context of her native Puerto Rico, where everyday violence and noise coexist with fantasy, code switching, slang, and humor, the wall functions as both witness and echo, reverberating back to us language that has become disembodied. Through random selection and their uncanny relation to social space, these words highlight the incongruity between our desire to thoughtfully communicate and the short-clipped phrases we've come to rely upon. But for Derrida, an echo is also an erasure. Communication denied. For Echo, the mountain nymph who pleased Zeus with her voice, so enraged Hera that her speech was thereafter limited to repeating the words of others, its own kind of silence. In following the philosophical discourse of friendship and its inverse, warfare, Derrida reveals the disappearance of women, not even a mirage, nothing. Desert and absolute silence, it would seem. Not even a woman soldier. Not even in the theory of the partisan is there the least reference to the role played by women in guerrilla warfare. He wonders if this figure without voice, left out of the conversation, isn't indeed the true partisan fighting from the underground. For her title, Calazo Lorenz inserts the Puerto Rican expression revolú, meaning disorder, confusion, ruckus, and jubilation, within the English word revolution, suggesting overthrow, change, upheaval, but even orbital motion. While the asterisk functions as both separation and joint, one might also consider it a star within a constellation of imaginative dialogue. This inclusion of one language within another, the swallowing of words, a biting of tongues, evokes the displacement of identity that occurs in the shift from localization to globalization with its unification of language systems. In collapsing, overlapping, and fusing languages, Calazo Lorenz accepts disjunctive systems of communication in a process of working through discrepancies in the act of living. And I would attain that language is not only a problem for the individual to solve, but also collectively, and particularly for us in the culture industry. For English becomes increasingly the lingua franca of the art world. And far too often, we are denied the nuance of difference in the production and dissemination of art. In choosing a language, the multilingual individual faces the specter of identity. Sorry. There we are. I am whom I speak. I am how I speak. I am what I speak. I am linguistically divided, simultaneously here and there. I am the dislocation of voice, cadence, and sonority into separate codes. I switch fluidly into amphibian mode. I am a shapeshifter, a code switcher. Location argues within the nameless profile. Her systems are nonsensical, non-hierarchical, and polyphonic. Word proliferation, in spite of its confusing repleteness, is an effort of communication and a gesture of intimacy. While it may be personally motivated, it is also politically charged. Patricia Villalobos also makes use of public space to intervene in a manner that draws out public conversation with passers-by, connecting with the local population just as significantly as with art viewers. Sistema, as part of the Havana Biennial of 2012, took over the walls of the Wilfredo Lamb Center. Like lichen growing on a tree, the sculptural intrusions belong to the surface of the wall in a codependency that precludes the usual determination of host-parasite relation. Again, the language is hybrid. English for cyst and Spanish for sistema or system. The cells form a metastasis from an original location, migrating across borders, bubbling up like revolutions in unsuspected territory. Metastasis is a medical term commonly used in association with cancer. It comes from the Greek meta, meaning beyond, and stasis, meaning place, hence the sense of displacement. But Derrida points out that for Carl Schmitt, writing on the relationship of men to warfare, stasis has two meanings. In the first place, repose, state of rest, position, arrest, or status. But secondly, stasis also means political unrest, movement, revolt, and civil war. The ambiguity of our relation to locality in today's struggles is almost always inflected by broad global momentum. This is most apparent in an ongoing project entitled Your Country Does Not Exist, begun in 2003 by the Spanish-Icelandic duo Libia Castro and Ólafur Ólafsson, in which the declarative statement provokes uneasy questions of status, citizenry, and power relations. Adopting the language of their host countries, even as they co-opt the public surfaces of advertising and consumer culture, such as t-shirts, cups, flyers, billboards, and walls. They question the status or stasis of our positions as citizens in a time when the dominant themes are, as Judith Butler suggests, assimilation and estrangement. Who sings the nation state? Judith Butler and Gayatri Spivak ask. In conflicts around the world, the relation of speech to legitimacy is critical. Castro and Ólafsson deconstruct both constitutional and juridical languages to distinguish between legalized codes of behavior and laws protecting human rights. Exorcising Ancient Ghosts, exhibited as a sound installation on the roof of the laundry house of the Palazzo Zenobio for the Venice Biennale, exposes the state's interference in our most discreet intimacies. The artist recorded two couples, one an Italian woman and a Balinese man speaking in Italian, and the other a New Zealand couple speaking in English. Reading juridical texts from ancient Greece that determine the parameters of relations between men, women, and foreigners. The actors read the text while making love. An incongruity as disconcerting as stimulating, rendering perverse the secrets of desire and conflating the boundaries between intimacy and political power. Seeping from headphones that lay on a rooftop used for drying bed linens, these deep breaths and lingering sighs evoke images of censorious taboos, but also the courageous union of fear with desire. Forbidden practice enunciated through the resonance of passion. The method of Castro and Ólafsson is collective, without being populist, employing a Brechtian sensibility of alienation in order to blur divisions between artistic and social practice. Andrea Geyer, Sharon Hayes, Ashley Hunt, Katja Sander, and David Thorne also highlight judicial language in a word-for-word performance of nearly 100 transcript pages of the combatant status review tribunals conducted by the U.S. Department of Defense between July 2004 and March 2005 in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba. The transcripts themselves reveal a mesmerizing study in erasure as witness, evidence, and identity are withheld from the record. Samuel Beckett could not have scripted a more Kafkaesque text for nothing than this small fraction of the thousands of pages made available through the Freedom for Information Act. Pages 2,954 to 1964, a public reading, premiered at Documenta 12 in Kassel in 2007, and was performed in November 2011 at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. The text, a literal pro forma protocol, continually circled back onto itself, a labyrinth of questions without answers, witnesses and evidence that would never be procured, and vague references to a higher authority that hovered over the proceedings as an absent God holding all of life in limbo. Tables were arranged in a square formation, while labels indicated detainee, narrator, tribunal members 1 and 2, tribunal president, recorder, representative, and translator. Readers took their seats for the duration of the testimony of one detainee, and then rotated, such that no one reader became identifiable as a character in a play. This emphasized the circuitous nature of contradiction. The gender of the reader and that of the text interchanged, and the seat of the translator remained empty to intimate the 50+ languages that could not be accommodated by the reading. This also negated any notion of seamlessness in a system that constructs jurisprudence as a reasonable extension of war. As testimonies unravel, we progress from perfunctory statements to animosity and sarcasm, to the tragic shroud of opacity, as one detainee's efforts to reveal his position with the Taliban as that of pretty boy is simply not understood. These transcripts might well have been redacted, so thick is the obscurity of the evidence against these men and boys, hidden behind a veil of national security and classified documents. I could not help but think of Gogol's Dead Souls, names of deceased serfs bought and sold as commodities for the sake of appearances, their absence ironically contrasted to a plenitude of verbiage far removed from public scrutiny. 5 rows of 17 benches reach across the floor of the Murray Guy Gallery, beckoning us to enter, even to sit. The presentation is clean and modest. The narrow plank seats are backless. Each is unique, but the uniformity of the poplar wood, sourced locally near the artist's studio, makes the linear arrangement both straightforward and repetitive, reminiscent of minimalist sculpture. While the displacement of the functional purpose of the objects, removed from their original context, implies a conceptual framework. Even so, we are inclined to ask, are these merely benches, plain and simple? First of all, there's a great deal of variety among the forms, including methods of craftsmanship and degree of symbolic decoration. Each bench, in fact, holds a place in the history of American utopian communities, each a meticulous reproduction of benches originally found in workplaces, refectory halls, and houses of worship, that reflects the social experimentation during the formative years of United States democracy. The sheer horizontality of form and presentation also invokes today's various Occupy and other radical movements that make use of inclusive, non-hierarchical means of discourse and consensus building. For the sculptor Francis Cape, benches are where we sit together, and he often organizes group talks in the various venues where he exhibits his work. Sharing a bench, writes Cape, means sharing the same material support, also sitting at the same level. But sitting on a bench is not as agreeable as it first seems. It requires physical discipline that to many of the social and religious communities of the 19th century America served to emphasize the moral discipline demanded of faith and idealism. CAPE imagines sharing giving communities, collectives whose members have individually renounced personal ownership. But oftentimes strict obedience instead of willing discipline was demanded by charismatic authoritarian leaders. Margaret Fuller, who was a founding member of the Brook Farm community, warned that such social experiments were in danger of becoming rigid and dogmatic. Her trepidation was realistic, yet in spite of her criticism, she nevertheless believed communal experiments were an important antidote to social convention. Utopia is impossible to build up, she writes. Yet every noble scheme, every poetic manifestation, prophesies to man his eventual destiny. CAPE's installation is evocative of an openness to explore these lessons again. His is a utopian project that prompts conversation in its directness and simplicity. Its optimism is perhaps a necessary quotient to action, possibility over failure. Even so, the bench seems fit for a Janus-faced interpretation of idealism, especially if one looks across town to another installation. There, spaced throughout Rosella Biscotti's installation, The Trial, are 5 factory-produced benches. Their backs and seats wood, but their frame wrought iron, their feet bolted to the floor. In contrast to the care CAPE instills in his handcrafted works, the focus of the construction for these benches is stability. Their use is not for gathering, but for waiting, not for speech, but for silence, not to encourage communal sharing, but to induce individual submission to authoritarian bureaucracy. Remnants of the Ala bunker, the high security courthouse, where former members of the Workers' Power and the Autonomia Operaia were on trial for the May 1978 kidnapping and murder of Aldo Moro, Christian Democratic leader and twice Prime Minister of Italy. These benches were part of the courtroom where the defendants heard testimony against them, but also on occasion took part in the proceedings. In Biscotti's installation, the benches are once again in attendance, seating observers during 2 days of performance. A 6-hour narrative of resistance, a simultaneous translation of courtroom proceedings that Biscotti edited from 200 hours of original recordings. At one point, the trial judge admits to Antonio Negri that the two speak different languages, and he's not speaking about Italian and Italian slang. He's speaking ideologically. Whereupon Negri turns the court from doc to dossier, interpreting Bertolt Brecht's Verfremdungseffekt for the court. As founder of the Workers' Party, Negri was charged with complicity in Moro's assassination. He was among numerous militants and intellectuals held in preventative prison from 1979 until the end of the trial in 1984. As suspected enemies of the state, they had few rights of habeas corpus. As intellectuals, their use of language was infused with the foreign influence of continental philosophy and modernist avant-garde. Brecht's Verfremdungseffekt, often translated as his alienation effect, renders a situation strange or different than the norm, a process intended to transform expectation into question. Brecht's theater was its own kind of tribunal of human rights, upsetting the balance of the status quo through the translation of language and action within any given context. Although Negri escaped to France after sentencing, he eventually returned to serve 13 of a 30-year term, during which he wrote and published his best-known publications, Empire, Multitude, and Commonwealth, all fundamental to radical political theory today. Francis Cape's benches, so meticulously rendered, are rational and pleasing to the eye. His notion of sitting together is antidote to the scant intimacy and cooperation in contemporary society. But in the back of one's mind lurks time out and Sunday school, or waiting in the doctor's office. So Rosella Biscotti's benches confirm a learned resistance to such codes of uniformity. Daniel Tammet, a savant with synesthesia, finds Plato's ideal society based on numerology to be seductive. According to this figure, Tammet remarks, everything would be divided evenly. There would be no war. There would be no discord. But there is always an element of humanity that escapes mathematics, that escapes numbers as well. Just as Negri could subvert the juridical bureaucracy with a lesson on Brecht's making strange, perhaps it is less the commonality of the benches than the differences of those who sit upon them that escapes predictability and lends credence to their appeal. The discrepancy between those who give speech to public space and that which can be said in an atmosphere of rising neoliberalism and its definition of progress is apparent in the failure of artist Fred Wilson to create a public monument in recognition of the African diaspora and the legacy of collective trauma within public memory in this country. For a public art commission in 2007, E Pluribus Unum, from many, one, the artist proposed to extract by way of a copy the figure of the freed slave from the Soldiers and Sailors Monument in downtown Indianapolis. He would position him alone, shifting the figure to look forward and to hold not shackles, but a flag, designed as an abstract collage of African and African diaspora insignia. As is usual for this artist, he chose to work with existing iconography, the only public image of an African American in all of Indianapolis, and to discuss his project in a series of public forums. Ultimately, that discussion led to backlash against the project, when sufficient resistance on the part of some community members towards the representation of a freed slave in the public space, no matter how he would be positioned, led to the cancellation of the commission in 2011. The desire to have only a positivist image undermined the advantages that the public debate served. That is, to instigate discussion into the invisibility of the African American in public monuments. Wilson's figure was deemed unsuitable. As a double, it was dislocated from its place of origin, such that it becomes, in Derridian terms, a topos, outside all place or placeless, without family or familiarity, outside of self, expatriate, strange, but also stranger to history, place, community. He is neither here nor there, neither I nor you, neither victor nor vanquished. The diaspora flag reinforces this. Though seated, he is without place, his identity unknown, and in perpetual reference to another, an echo from the periphery. The figure causes a ruckus through stasis, both rest and unrest, a partisan's revolutionary gesture of rupture and upheaval. I can imagine numerous additional examples of creative gestures to upset the balance of expectation and perception. For example, Evgeny Fix's exposure of the homophobic Cold War rhetoric between Moscow and Washington, a rhetoric that began as early as the late 19th century and continues as political dueling at the expense of gay rights and gay lives in Russia today. Or Thomas Hirschhorn's Gramsci Monument that transposes art from the marketplace to the housing project. Or Sharon Hayes' intimate speech recited in the public square. There is also Pablo Helguera's purposeful mistranslation of language in Rogaland that serves as a kind of excavation to both face and efface death, disappearance, absence. Instead, I'll end with my own invisible practice of a 6-month speech fast, when I endeavored to exchange a humiliating rebuke into a self-determined practice of silence. From September 11th, 2011 until March 6th, 2012, I conducted a practice of selective speech, a form of controlled speech that is, with the exception of communication with my students, son, and elderly mother, I was silent. And my husband, who's in the audience tonight, will attribute to this. He wasn't an exception. The dates are symbolic, one political, the other personal, connecting to memories of trauma, healing, and creativity. Ultimately, the approximately 6-month period was divided into thirds. During the first, I denied functional, social, and intimate speech. During the second, I denied myself social and intimate speech. And during the final third, I denied myself intimate speech. For each of the 181 days, I wrote an entry of fewer than 100 words into a log. Early on, I wrote, week 2, day 8. I take up this fast to address the relation of speaker to listener. A dramatic rupture in my life denied me your voice. Since then, I have been writing blind, without sight, without voice. Where is speech? And at the end, I condensed the entries into a 12-minute performance, ending thus. Week 24. I once thought I knew Anam Indieta. I once thought I knew. Did you care for me? Laugh at my foolishness. Regret we ever met. So heavy was your silence. I wished to make you laugh. You live life as a resistance fighter, and I but a necessary casualty. Week 25. The tenderness I feel. Breathe, smile, laugh, listen, forgive, yield, care. I care, you care, she cares. Week 26, day 181. Such that it is, as it was, this story, neither yours nor mine, cannot be told. Yet I love it as a child, not for her silence, but for her efforts to speak. What have I learned of silence? So very little. What began as a gesture against perceived injustices ended as an aesthetic lament. When the public expression of trauma is minced over in traditional representations, when a misguided sense of progress determines that the past be silenced, buried, and forgotten, then perhaps the strategy to unsilence is through tactical means. In response to Derrida's text, The Politics of Friendship, I begin to think of art as friendship, embedded in contradictory experience, loving without being loved, time without having time, and faith in the absence of assurance. It is an event rather than a desire or a potential. It can be exceptional and as such decisive. Silence is a latent responsibility toward the other. Derrida calls it a sort of counterculture of knowing how to keep silent, to evacuate words, to gain breathing space. For Ludwig Wittgenstein, the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. I would like to suggest that we strategically use limitations to our advantage. Unhinge the prohibition of speech through meaningful silence. Abuse through the exposure of vulnerability. Poverty through purposeful privation. In the interference from here to there, make space for the asterisk. Infiltrate through inversion, upset expectations, but above all, gain agency through contradiction, and make strange the resistance. Fail better. Thank you. Actually, let me first frame this briefly. It's the beginning of the research was thanks to a curator and critic, Neri Melkonian, and a conference she gave and invited me to attend and participate in called Strategies of Unsilencing. And that was held in Yerevan, Armenia last year. Prior to that, however, the Danish pavilion at the 54th Venice Biennale that was curated by Katerina, hold on, I made a note, Katerina Gregos. She called it Speech Matters. That was very inspiring to the very first kind of preliminary investigation. It kind of prompted the work. So I owe both of those curators credit for this work. And perhaps in addition to that, I would just say that a lot of the pieces, as a whole, it was formed by pieces, you know, almost like a quilt. I had been feeling quite stymied, that the opportunities that were being offered were virtually non-existent. And the writer Amitav Ghosh, who was also attending this conference, suggested that I start my own online column. And it was night and day. It was absolutely the right advice. It was incredibly perceptive. It was, you know, I just suddenly all these words started gushing out of me. And so a lot of what's in this paper were created as small pieces first, and then I started to recognize that there was a cohesion to the art that I was looking at and investigating. And I thought, you know, perhaps this will somehow form a conversation, a communication, and I'm hoping now the beginning of a new book project. So if you have comments, it would really help me in the next stage of this. Not an easy question, but a good one. First of all, I'm paraphrasing Derrida, so he's helping me articulate some of this experience. I had reached, I think there are varying times of our lives where we reach crisis points. And it's usually because there's a complete tsunami of impact from work, from, you know, health issues, family issues, emotional issues. It all fell on me, happened at once. Through the healing process, I made, you know, several different steps between therapy and you know, medical doctors, and you know, everything was helping, but nothing was really getting to where I needed to get. And I recognized that I really needed a complete change in how I looked at the world and how I negotiated my day-to-day life. And I wouldn't recognize that change unless I enforced a very abrupt and demanding change and discipline. So I no longer remember how the idea came to me, but it came to me in a flash in the middle of the night. I woke up in the morning, I told Peter, and I thought he'd say, "You're crazy." And he said, "Yes, that's what you need to do." And I think sometimes we really do need to upset the balance in a very dramatic way. A lot of artists have, you know, done endurance practices, a lot of performance artists. And in some ways, this is part of that genre, but it's also trying to do it in a gentle way, in a way that won't hurt people. Now, of course, silence, refusing to speak to your friends, even if you explain ahead of time, can create a lot of misunderstandings. So it was not an unproblematic period of time. I allowed exceptions for emergencies, so it was not a pure practice in the way that we know Teixeira Shui has performed his endurance performance pieces that last a year. But I still feel it was a creative practice, and its intent and end result was it upset the balance enough to shift how I took in, how I thought about the information, and how I then engaged. I learned to re-engage with individuals differently. Yeah. September 11th was, for so many of us, a traumatic experience. for those of us who suffered prior trauma that was repressed, significantly and absolutely repressed, it served as a trigger. At least that was my case. And just things started kind of building up and surfacing. Nightmares, daydreams, just odd messages. And I kept pushing them down. And it took a decade before it just exploded. But basically it was very, very deeply repressed trauma that was triggered by September 11th. But September 11th also was a public and a social, it was for the many, it impacted all of us. And the second date was a very private date, so I wanted that sense of one and many, private and public. Yeah. Well, obviously from my choices, I do sort of, my interests incline towards those artworks that are socially engaged, concerned with social justice, often participatory or performative. But no, I think that would be wrong to say that it's not possible to infuse into your work that has, that comes about in the form of an object, those kinds of ideas and suggestions. I think even in the very material, intense work of B. Wirtz, for example, and his accumulations of everyday materials into just lovely assemblages, even there's a delicacy that connotes affection and fondness and interrelationships, if not interpersonal relationships. So, just the infusion of the idea of the everyday, and his works are, extremely abstracted and to look at and to kind of be in awe of their, combination of simplicity and complexity. So yeah, I think theoretically at least, and yes, one could find examples. Mm-hmm. Gosh, that's a real tough one. Part of the symptoms that came through in my negotiating with a traumatic past was an addiction to email. It's not an unfamiliar addiction anymore. So included in the speech fast was no email. So, the denial of communication, though it had exceptions, it was across the board. It was no telephone calls, no email, no written letters. And yet at the same time, it was not a retreat. People say, why don't you go, to a Buddhist colony? Why don't you go on retreat? I said, no, it's not about disengaging. It's actually about re-engaging. So I wanted to see how I could make these gestures of listening as opposed to gestures of need, and kind of about face my own kind of automatic maneuverings. Yeah. I'm certainly familiar with her work, but I was engaged with her work much more in, like 89, 90. I can't say that it came to mind, but I did have certainly, the sense that there were others who went before me, that I wasn't breaking ground, that I mean, just like in my talk, I think of all these artists as my mentors. They're helping me they're helping me think through the world. They're helping me find ways by which I can engage with the world. So whether she came to mind during that period or not, she's there as an impression and as a influence and mentor, as is in her early work, Marina Abramovich. I'm less enamored in the later manifestations, Anna Mendieta, Teixeira Shui, but even the very serious conceptual artists who would not go in the realm of emotions that I do. Yeah.
And I guess that I was also curious for you to talk more about code switching, that you kind of touched on it a little bit.
Yeah.
Are you talking about racial code switching?
Language code
Yeah.
switching, yeah. That really I'm pulling from the work of Naida Colatzo-Lawrence. I think she's quite brilliant in her investigation of language. She works with both her language she generates herself and random text that she generates through the computer, and creates amazing visual, concrete poetry through that use of random text. But all of it is in order to investigate what is the impact of this constant implosion of information and dialogue, such as you were talking about, the news, the opinions, the blurbs we get, the press releases, this barrage. How do you take it in? How do you filter what you might take in? How do you survive that constant influx? I think her work is a really good example, and she's taken that much further. I'm kind of gleaning, and that's each one of these artists is kind of an area to delve into more completely, which is why it becomes interesting as a book for me. I think I can go much further. They get harder and harder. Maybe that's why I'm investigating, because deep down I'm an existential cynic who doesn't believe in truth. One of my early careers was as a photojournalist, and my images were so manipulated by the editors and publishers that I just thought there was absolutely no relationship between my intent in the field and their actual use, which is why I stopped following that profession. One reason, there were others. And yet, yes, I'm very seduced by the philosophical investigation, the politics of truth, the politics of friendship, the relationship of language and, in our sense, visual representation to reality. How close. I think Rabbi Mouet has really kind of sparked almost a pleasure in this search, in how he keeps going to this reverse shot concept, this notion of reversal, that we cannot be certain, and we have to learn how to live with that uncertainty and find pleasure in it, or find a different degree of truth. So it's still vague, and philosophically that's probably the deepest and most difficult part of the investigation, because it's not so very concrete, even though I keep looking to the examples that the artists provide as, my route. I'm going to embarrass my husband. I think it saved our marriage. So, if you have a relationship crisis, just, switch, reverse roles or something. The one who's been the one who talks all the time should suddenly shut up. And the one who, has to listen all the time should learn to speak. So in terms of interpersonal relations, I just, I learned to yield and, not, and just let go of the control mechanisms, just in terms of my broader life too. I just rearranged priorities, and I rearranged my expectations of people. And I think I became much more autonomous and found ways to generate work on my own and not rely on others. I think actually it's a good question, because I think that's a problem for artists. We always think our work relies on the critic, the curator, the teaching position, the this, the that. And you have to find ways to work when you're left with nothing. And in a way, my crisis had left me with nothing. And so this speech fast was only symbolic manifestation of that, and allowed me to calm down enough to restructure. Yeah, and I think the structure moved from outside, or the expectation for structure moved from outside to inside. So it became an internal structure. I still wish I had sort of migrated that speech fast to at least a once a week and kept it going. I would have to kind of learn to do it again if I wanted to take up that practice. Yeah, these are all really fantastic questions. That's the greatest struggle in this research, which is kind of both looking out to art and seeing what I can do through my text in service of art, because that's kind of what I care about. And at the same time, kind of dealing with these existential questions that lie within. But one reason I tacked on the element of my speech fast is when I gave this much shortened version in Armenia, the moderator of the panel said to me afterwards, she said, "As much as you love this art, this paper seems to me to be something you're trying to say, not what they're trying to say." And, I was sort of struck, dumbfounded, and so I thought I had to be honest and include myself in the work. They're very closely allied. On an everyday basis, and this is why maybe it was the shortest duration, but the functional speech was the most amusing. How do you negotiate the pharmacy? How do you negotiate the grocery store? All these things we take for granted. And I had the card that I showed in the slide, I would hand out so that people wouldn't think I was rude. I'm the kind of person people ask directions, and I didn't want to come across as rude. And a lot of the people would decide that they too had to be silent. So that was quite amusing, and I thought, oh, it's not fair to make them do the long haul. So I kind of renegotiated the rules of the endeavor at each 2-month interval. No, I didn't get too much feedback from friends, actually, if it caused them to reflect more on what they had to say. But I think it made a number of people aware that often we rely on speech that's meaningless, that we really don't need to say half of what we say during the day. And, you know, particularly in an interpersonal relationship, you know, if there's milk, there's milk. If there's no milk, there's no milk. Big deal, you know, you make do. It's not so life-threatening that you have to have a debate over the phone who stops at the store on the way home. So odd little things, you know, the practice of everyday life became very, I became very alert to the practice of everyday life. I really regretted not being able to say anything down at Occupy Wall Street. I went down and I'd hang out, and people would be amused. They recognized my speech fest as a protest, so I appreciated that. But I couldn't participate as broadly, and the timing was, my speech fest started 6 days before. And ironically, I should have known, in some ways I should have known of the event, because my mentor Neil Smith was one of the leading instigators, but he never let on that it was happening. Well, I'm stealing those words from Samuel Beckett, and you know, I think this came up in the crits today, the studio visits. We're so afraid of failing, and it can become a point of humiliation and shame for us, especially as artists, with the necessity of infusing so much of ourselves, of giving so much of ourselves into our work. And when it comes down to it, how do we get beyond the ordinary if we don't accept failure? So I think we just have to give in to making mistakes and accepting accountability for them when they've, you know, betrayed somebody else's faith in us. But also, you know, just say, okay, I can do something different. I can move on. I can do better. And I think striving to do better, you also have to accept the fact that you might fail better, you might fail bigger. That's the balance of risk. Who was it? I don't know. I wish I could attribute this, but an artist I spoke with it was Rosalie Goldberg. She recently said it we met at an opening, and she said, you know, I think that it comes down to risk and faith, that you have to have faith in yourself, and you have to be willing to risk to the point of failure. So that's kind of what I mean by that. Thank you so much.